This graph here shows our best estimate of how global inequality has moved over the 2 centuries. On the horizontal axis, you have time from 1820, when we have some first GDP per capita data, which are actually necessary in order to anchor these numbers for individual countries. And then on the vertical axis, you have the Gini coefficient, which is as you know, the measure of inequality that ranges from 0, when everybody has the same income, which is obviously a theoretical situation, to 100, where the entire income of the world were technically in the hands of one person. Now, as you notice there, first you notice that actually the level of inequality measured by the Gini coefficient was relatively high and in the beginning of the 19th century. That level is about 55 on the graph. But more importantly, you notice that the next century, actually a century and a half, that level just kept on going up and up and up. And when you say, like, why did that level go up and up, you basically find out that in that period, and I will first focus on that period because it really is a period which is actually telling us a lot about the subsequent periods, because it was a very sort of special period. And I also sort of called it in that sense from Karl Marx to Frantz Fanon and back to Marx, and you will see the reason why it is the case. But let me then start with that first period. If you take this Gini of 55, or actually higher Ginis along the road all the way to 1950s, and you decompose them into between country and within country parts, you notice on this graph here, this is the part which is actually due to inequalities between nation states. Now, the interesting thing here is to notice that that part is relatively small. And that part is relatively small because the gaps between mean incomes, which enter into this calculation, were small in the beginning of the 19th century. As the Industrial Revolution progressed and the Western countries, and then later Japan, became richer, that part, of course, goes up and up and up. And you notice that actually practically at every next reading, you actually have higher inequality between nation states. But what was also important is that actually in the very beginning of the 19th century and all the way to the mid-19th century, and even all the way practically to the end of the 19th century and the World War I, the within inequality, which means inequality within nation states, was very large. Now, to give you an idea what are these two inequalities, in a simpler way, I called the within inequality, within nation-state inequality, I called it class inequality, because that inequality sort of is an inequality between, let's suppose, peasants and landlords, workers and capitalists, generally poor and rich people within each country. So if that inequality is high, as it was in the 19th century, that indicates that actually the cleavage within nation-state between the poor and the rich people. The second cleavage, which I call location, which is the cleavage of the differences in mean income between the countries, as you can notice on the graph, was relatively small in the 19th century and then was rising and becoming more and more important as we sort of progressed towards the 20th century. And it really then reached very high levels in the mid-20th century. So that means also that when you look at the very first period, and actually it's a very important point, and that's why I really wanted to focus on the first period, you have what I call there the age of empires and of class struggles. Now you have the age of class struggles because the main cleavage is between classes within each nation state. And that also implies that the poor classes, for example, in England, would be at approximately similar level of income than as poor classes in Russia or India. So when you actually think that somebody like Marx was writing, in 1850s and 1860s, what later became Das Kapital, obviously he didn't have these numbers, but his perception of the world was fundamentally correct. The main cleavage was within nation states. And moreover, if the incomes of the poor people in different countries were similar, you could actually speak of something like international proletarian solidarity or solidarity between really poor people in different countries because their material conditions were similar. But as you noticed, actually, as we progress into the 19th century, and again, that was something which was interesting because it was noticed at the end of Marx's life and also later with Engels, they noticed that the British working class was actually becoming richer. So parts of the increase in income in England were also trickling down to the poor, to the working class people. And we actually have now, obviously, the data going back to, for example, to Bob Allen, who actually shows the same thing, actually, about the rising real wage in the latter part of the 19th century. So then you have the situation that the material conditions of poor people in rich countries start diverging from the material conditions of the poor people in poor countries. So then you have, in some sense, an undermining of that sort of idea of proletarian solidarity which would hold across the globe. We know that from the work of many people, including Piketty, that after World War I, we have really beginning of the shrinking of the differences within nation states. So the first period, I'm going back to it, was the period where you essentially had the age of empire, which was driven by this large gap in real incomes between the rich part of the world, which was basically Western Europe, the United States, and Japan, and everybody else. And at the same time, you had the age of class struggles within those countries. But then, after World War I, and in the entire, practically, 20th century, we moved to a very different world. And this is, for example, the world that I was born in, and I sort of stupidly assumed that's the world which always existed, but in reality it didn't exist. It was the world which was created by the Industrial Revolution. And that world was the world of the three worlds, the first world, the second world, which was the world of socialism, but it had a logic because it was the world with income levels that are in between the first and the third world, and the third world was essentially the three continents, large continents, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. What was also interesting then, you see the change in the ideology, because it was very commonly said, and you also had that in sort of a world systems theory when you actually have core countries and periphery, but it was generally sort of perceived or appreciated that the gaps now which existed between classes have now become global gaps between what Mao Zedong called global bourgeoisie, which was the first world, and the global proletariat, which was the third world. So the trilateral, trilateral of the countries, not trilateral of the rich people, but trilateral of these three continents of the third world was really also a very special reflection of the underlying global inequality. And that was the sort of a period, the second period, which basically we can date from the end of the World War I all the way to the end of the 20th century. So that was what, to some extent parallels what was called the short 20th century, because it is again goes from the end of World War I to maybe 1980s. It is related to the fall of communism, but it is actually essentially then the third period or the end of the second period are driven by the rise of Asia. So then what happens in the most recent period is something yet different compared to the other two. We have the age of convergence in mean incomes, and we have this age of convergence simply because countries with lots of people are becoming richer. And that's why I've talked about the rise of Asia, and they are actually coming and becoming more similar to the rich world. But at the same time, we have much more of a cleavage now within nation states. And this is obvious not only in the US and the UK or other European countries, it's obvious with China, with India, with Russia. So we are now in a third age where we have convergence at the level of nation states, but we have cleavage and divergence within nation states. So this third age, if we were to extend it into the future, let's suppose to the end of the 21st century, might eventually look very much like the first stage before the Industrial Revolution. And to some extent, there is a certain logic to that. You have the Industrial Revolution like a big bang. It launched some countries on the path to growth. Others really remained where they were, and some of them, like China, went even backwards. But once they started catching up, they're in some sense undoing the relative income effects of the Industrial Revolution, and they're bringing the world back to the situation which existed before 1820, where it could be that the major cleavage becomes again the class cleavage within nation states. Now, I have to say this is, of course, a kind of a guesswork in that sense, because we don't know first if that growth of Asia would continue. We also don't know, which is, of course, more important in this case, we don't know what will happen with many African countries where you have large increase in population, and in Africa, if Africa does not catch up with the rich world, the rest of the world, then, of course, that divergence itself might actually no longer be operative. So obviously we have many question marks, but having said all of that, I think it's very clear that if we look 200 years back, we have really lived or are currently living in the third type of world from the point of view of global income inequality, but more importantly from the point of view of global politics. That could be, of course, shown in many different ways. So this is actually, I've used previously another measure of inequality, which is Stale index. With the Gini index, it's, you get more or less the same results. The important part here is that you notice here, this is actually the difference in inequality measured by the Gini coefficient between nation states. And you notice there at the very end, which is the current period, we have a fairly dramatic decline of that inequality because of the rise of Asia. And if you really then sort of look at these two revolutions, the Industrial Revolution and today the technological ITC revolution, you actually notice very many similarities. I've already mentioned that in undoing some of the effects of the first Industrial Revolution. But if you look at, for example, deindustrialization, there are also similarities there. As we know, the first Industrial Revolution was really linked with deindustrialization in India. India was like a top producer of clothing, of cotton and other things. And then, of course, that production really went down to, 5% of its original peak. But we have now similarly deindustrialization in the rich countries because of outsourcing, because of ability of poorer countries to produce the same goods much more cheaply. So very often when you look at these two episodes, two eras, you actually see them almost like in a mirror image. They are mirror images of each other. The second graph here shows you the decline in the importance of the within component, and with the increase then towards the top, as you actually notice, that was actually the most sort of recent increases of inequality, which of course large for individual countries, but of course they are small when you look at them at the global level overall. So this was the political meaning of globalization. And as I was saying before, really with any decomposition, you really have always to tease out, to figure out, and actually to be driven by the interest in what is the social or political meaning of that globalization. When I mentioned also that the main cleavage in the latter part of the 20th century, and still remains today, the cleavage between nation states, because one have to clarify this. The cleavage between nation states is on the decline because of the rise of Asia, but it's still a dominant cleavage. So in other words, distinguish between two things: the level of that cleavage, which is very large, and the rate of change. The rate of change is such that that gap between nation states is becoming less, but it's still the dominant one. Now, the important part to realize there is that with that cleavage still being the dominant, this is not the reason, but it's the background to economic migration. So when I speak of migration today, I always like to define migration as being a movement of people under conditions of globalization being conducted with differences in mean country incomes between nation states. I will explain this long sentence in a minute. In order to think of today's migration, which is driven by economic factors, you have to acknowledge first the fact that there is globalization, because without globalization, if you had closed nation states, people would not be able to move. First, for some states, maybe they would not be allowed to get out. Other states would not accept them. And thirdly, they would not even know how big the differences are. So globalization does the following. It actually conveys the knowledge of these large differences in income which exist between people in different parts of the world, and also, because of facility of travel, gives them the means to actually bridge that gap and go to a different country and multiply their income by 5 or 10 times. But if you had all of that globalization, but did not have the differences in mean income, which are substantial between the countries, you would not have systemic movements of migrants. Imagine the situation like it existed when the European Union countries were only the rich countries of Western Europe, like 15 at that time. The differences in income between them were very small. So you didn't have systemic migration from France to Germany. You probably have people from Germany, obviously you had people going to Spain because they like, weather in Spain. Many retirees bought houses there and so on. But you didn't have systemic migration because the gaps in income were relatively small. As soon as you open up the European Union to EU 28, you already have systemic migration because the income levels in the East, and actually to some extent now in the South, are actually much lower than the incomes in the North. Now, then imagine the world as a whole where these gaps are many times greater. So in that sense, you require not only globalization, you require, for large movements of migration, you require also large differences in mean country incomes. Now, the implication of that politically is that you are not going to have quick fixes for migration. Because if you look at this, either you really have to overturn globalization and close national borders, which we see, of course, some movements over that coming from the recipient countries, or you actually have to equalize mean incomes. Now, I mentioned before that the process of convergence is to some extent equalizing these mean incomes. But that process really would take, for the equalization to really kick in a serious way, would take more than 50 or probably 100 and 150 years. So we are not really going to actually have a change in the underlying forces of migration for a long time to come. And I often give this because, of course, Europe is very sensitive to migration, I would say even more than the United States. And when I talk about that in Europe, there is, of course, always a little bit of an air of despair in the room because people really have to realize that this is not a short-term issue, that actually that is something that cannot be dealt every summer as the migrants come. You just change the rules and try to push them out. You actually have to deal with that problem as a secular issue. And moreover, simply a note on Europe, the gap between the European incomes and Middle Eastern incomes and African incomes has never been as large in history. So if you look at the two shores of the Mediterranean and just compare the incomes ratios, there has never been a gap which is as large as now. So it is obviously irrational to expect that people would not actually try to bridge that gap and increase their income level. It would be the same thing if you had really systematic differences in rates of return to capital. It's very strange. People are actually realizing the differences in income to capital much more easily if you tell them, look, you're making here 2% per year, and then there is another country where you can make 20 or 30. So, where are you going to invest your money? You're obviously going to go to the other country. But the same thing is true for labor. If you make somewhere $200 per month, and there is another place that you can make $2,000 per month, you obviously will have an incentive to go to that other place which pays you much more. This is actually simply another implication of these large differences in global inequality, which are still driven by the differences in mean country incomes, despite the fact that these differences are diminishing because of the role of Asian growth. And as I mentioned before, we can actually, when you look in the future, we can expect, of course, that the world will become more convergent, that income differences will become smaller. But we have to say that with the caveat because we really don't know what will happen, or actually we cannot even have some reasonable guesses about what will happen to Africa, especially because of high rates of growth of population in Africa, which then would require on a per capita basis rates of growth of about 7 or 8% per year for the overall growth rate, which actually would not be very easy to achieve, and actually would mean probably tripling or quadrupling of the growth rates which exist currently. I mentioned in the beginning that really we have great advantage nowadays to have much more data and that we can really look at things and the world in a very sort of heterogeneous way. So it's actually we don't look at the world simply as the averages. So now let me illustrate the difference between looking at the averages, which is of course useful in many respects, but that's not the only story in town anymore, and heterogeneity. If we look at the resurgent Asia and the increase of Asian incomes with respect to the rich countries, we are looking really at the averages because we are comparing the GDP per capita of those countries, disregarding the distribution, obviously. And this is based on the data from the Madison Project. And these are the same data that also underlie now Penn World Tables, except that Penn World Tables don't go back in the history. Actually, in this case, we go back to 1820, but we could actually, in some cases, go even to the 1750. What this graph shows is the ratio in GDP per capita of China and India with respect to the UK and of Indonesia with respect to the Netherlands. As you know, of course, the Netherlands was the colonial power in the case of Indonesia. And what you notice here in all three cases, you notice first that the incomes of those countries were, of course, already by 1820 lower than the West European incomes, but the ratio was not as high as it became later. So we are talking about Western incomes being about 2.5 times on average higher than Asian incomes. But then you have this period that I was talking about before, between 1850s all the way to the 1950s, 1 century. I mean, in Chinese sort of way of thinking of that, that was the century of humiliation. In the Indian way of thinking of that, it's really century of the British colonialism. And likewise in the case of Indonesia, which also had pretty rough time, as some people know. Actually, Indonesia was one of the first countries where the system, very similar to the Stalinist system of quotas, was imposed on local population, and very severe punishments were exacted if people would not deliver like in the Congo, if they would not deliver the quota of the goods that they were assigned. And then you see actually all of them really declining tremendously, and so much so that basically the ratio becomes 20-1 between the incomes of the Western countries and Asian countries. And then exactly at the period of Indian independence and then Indonesia independence and the Chinese Revolution, you have sort of the trough, actually the worst point basically of the relative incomes between these countries and the West. And then that low point remains, as you can see here, for a while, and then from the 1970s or actually 1980s, you have a rebound. Now, if you extend that, and these things change fairly quickly, because if the rich countries grow very little, and if the Asian countries grow by 5 or 6%, these gaps really within 10 or 20 years, they become much smaller. So we will continue probably with this rebound. When it comes to China, it's interesting actually to look at the fact that China now has an average income or GDP per capita which is at the level of the poorest European Union country. Actually, Chinese income is at the level of Bulgaria. But with the projection of like 6% growth versus EU projection of like 1.5%, by 2042, I believe, the average income of China would be at the median income of the European Union. So this is this really big change that I was talking about before. But we can now go beyond the averages, use the same historical data, and actually get much more informed about what happened in individual countries. So let me start here with the two rich countries, which are actually also changed their not only income position overall, but also position of different classes. Now, this is the ratio between the US income at different percentiles of income distribution compared to the income of the equivalent percentiles in the UK. So look at the line which is at 100. 100 would mean that people who are, let's suppose, at the bottom in the US or the middle in the US or the rich people in the US would have exactly the same income as the people in the UK. So the first line is from the year 1870. So first, notice on the left, the number is 140. What does it mean? It means that slavery just ended, but poor people in the US had 40% higher income than people who were the same position in the UK income distribution. In other words, it really sort of works well with our prior, that the US was a country where actually an immigrant or somebody would come at very low level of his or her position in the US income distribution and be much better off than an equivalent level, equivalent position in Europe. As I said, notice that you would actually have higher income among the poor people in the US than the poor people in the UK. Then you notice, of course, there was around the 40th percentile, the two incomes are the same. But then the important part is that as you go further in the income distribution, American incomes again dominate British incomes. And this is the American middle class that also became richer compared to the English middle class in 1870. And the final point is very important. People at the top after the 90th percentile in the US were actually poorer than obviously the top aristocracy or large capitalists in England. So when we look at this graph in 1870 between the UK and the US, you say, what are the advantages of the United States? Poor people in the US are better off than poor people in Europe. Middle class in the US is actually also better off than the middle class in Europe. And the US top is actually poorer than aristocratic or capitalist top in the UK. So it's essentially the story that is very intuitive and it makes sense. And actually these numbers actually reinforce that story because obviously the numbers came independently. It's not that they were fit to fit the story that I just told you, but it's actually we get the story from the numbers. 40 years later, before the World War I, you notice that the shape of the curve is still the same. But because the US has actually advanced compared to the UK, so now everybody in the US is better off than in the UK, but the shape of the curve is the same. It is now true that actually even the rich people in the United States are now richer than the rich people in England, but the poor people remain much better off in the US than in England. The American middle class is now significantly better off than the middle class in Europe. Then we go fast forward a century. Of course, I could have taken years in between, but it's actually more dramatic when you take more recent numbers. And you have this really major reversal in the relative positions. Now, US still, of course, is richer than the UK, so most people are better off in the United States. But notice two very important changes. The first change is that the poor people in the US now are actually worse off than the poor people in Europe or in the UK. That's the result, of course, of what we have known actually for a while, that what we now generally find, for example, with Luxembourg income data, we find that when you go to the lower deciles in rich West European countries, people at these lower deciles are better off than the Americans. And this is what you notice here. But realize that it was not the case in the past. It was really the reverse, that actually the poor people in this country, in the United States, were actually better off than poor people in Europe. And then what you notice that now the relative position of Americans compared to the English, or generally to West Europeans, improves as they become richer. So you're actually, if you're very poor in the US, your relative position is bad with respect to the Western Europe. But as you become better off, not only do you actually earn more, but your relative position compared to the equivalent person in Europe is improving. And who is actually at the best position are very rich Americans. So you have an entirely different shape of the income distribution curve now, if you compare the relationship now with the relationship, 100 years ago and 150 years ago. So this is where this heterogeneity in data allows you to do, is actually to go much beyond simply the averages and to look actually how the relative positions of people have changed. So you can do the same thing with China and the UK. And this is, again, to some extent, following upon that original graph where I showed you how the Chinese relative incomes declined very severely with respect to the UK and then had a recent rebound. But look at 1870. 1870, going back to what I was saying before about similarity in conditions between the poor people, you see that the relative income of the poor people in China compared to income of the equivalently poor people in the UK was not that bad. It was much lower. It was actually 40% of the UK income. But within the income distribution of China, they were the least poor compared to their equivalent in the UK. Everybody else was actually poor, and as you can see here, the average ratio was about 20%, which means that on average, most of the people in the UK were actually 5 times richer, better off than people in China. Then you go to 1950, which I said was really the lowest point in terms of China's relative position. And then you notice that actually now everybody was equally poor. So essentially, you have Chinese people who are between 5% and 10% of real income of the UK, which means the ratio is 10 to 1 or even 20 to 1. So you notice that in the first period, that was this sort of a relative similarity in the conditions between the poor people in rich country like the UK and poor people in poor country like in China. Now that has disappeared. By 1950, all the Chinese were equally poor compared to the English. I'm emphasizing the point here that it's a relative measurement. I'm not saying that all the Chinese were equally poor, because people obviously in the top of the Chinese income distribution had higher income than people at the bottom. But their relative position to their equivalent individuals in England or Western Europe or the United States was extremely low. Of course, now you have, because of the rise of China, at every income position, you have the situation that has improved. But it has improved especially strongly at the very top of the Chinese income distribution, because underlying the rise of incomes of China was increase in income inequality in China. So in other words, the rise of China benefited disproportionately people who are at the top. So now the people at the top are actually most similar to the people, to the equivalent people in the UK. And then if you compare, like for example, 1870 and today, you have an interesting situation that in the past, if you look at the relative Chinese incomes, it was really poor people in China that were most similar to poor people in the UK. If you look at the situation today, it is really the rich people in China who are the most similar to the rich people in the UK. So you see really very dramatic changes, obviously, over the long periods of time, not only in the means, but in the relative positions of different income groups. A different way to do that is to compare the US and Chinese income distribution. If you were to do these income distributions in the 1980s, you would practically have two distributions with no overlap. In other words, for all intents and purposes, the Chinese income distribution would end before entering into the American income distribution, like practically meaning that in a statistical sense, every American would be richer than every Chinese. In 2002, you already see, of course, the two distributions overlapping, not very significantly. About 23% of the Chinese population is within the US income range. But as the time goes on, and it's actually a relatively short period of 11 years, you see actually about 70% of the Chinese population within US income range. That does not mean that they have the same incomes. They actually have much lower incomes. But it simply says that the two distributions are now overlapping. So more and more of the distribution would overlap. If I were to draw this graph, for example, for two European countries like France and Germany, you would have the two distributions almost entirely overlapping. In other words, if you were to randomly pull out the people from a distribution, it would be very difficult for you to say, I mean, obviously chances would be 50-50 that somebody is French or somebody is German. But when you have two very different distributions, like what they said, China in 1980, and the US in 1980, if you were to go at the top of the income distribution and we were to pull out people there, you could actually be almost 90 or 99% sure that what you would actually, person who would you pull out from the top would be American, and person who would pull out from the bottom would be Chinese. But nowadays that situation is no longer the case, and actually that situation has changed.